So we're talking about making art and bread in France Profonde. And the reason it's France Profonde, if you're in Paris, you're in France. If you're outside of Paris, you're in the Provence. And if you are in the rural areas of France, you are in France Profonde. Now, in order, if I want to disabuse everybody of the fact that I am not going to teach you how to make bread, all right? This is going to show you how you restore an old mill so you can make your own flour, so you can make your own bread. So here we are in rural France, France Profonde, in the Aveyron region of France, where there are 2 million Roquefort sheep. Roquefort cheese, of course, is made out of sheep's milk. Rolling hills, steep, beautiful country, greens that you just don't even believe exist. And there's our little village of Plaisance and all of its 60 residents. And if you go a couple of kilometers out down the main road out of Provence, you'll see an old water mill that sits behind an old arched bridge called La Pilande Basse. And naturally, in a water mill, there's water, there's the babbling brooks, and a lot of noise of water. This is a video that, don't worry if you might or may not, depending on your download speed, hear my voice or not, don't worry about it. Water tumbles down from the big fall, finds its way down the flat rocks to the slide to the personal swimming hole. I guess the sound of water is what I'm getting at here. Their water sounds were everywhere. So this is what we saw when we first went to look at the mill. The roofs were falling in. Somebody had put a bad roof on here. This was a complete ruin. We couldn't even get up to it. So we hired a crew, a contractor, and some one of 4 or 5 people for every time we were in France for 6 months at a time. We had a crew like this working on restoring the mill. They started with the roof, and Claude, this is a roof that's made out of what's called lows, or what we would call schist. These are not small stones. The carpentry had to be completely redone in order to support the weight of this roof. And that's one of Claude's apprentices putting the clouk on top of a new chimney. The clouk is the mother hen that protects the building. There's Bernard, our hero stonemason, who saved our fannies many times. And here are his wheelbarrows of cement that his guys would put in our living room salon while they went and had their 2-hour lunches. They'd come back and then they'd schlep their stones into the back. The only way to get into the back near the mill was through the front door and through the living room. And that babbling brook was not always babbling. We had crash floods, flash floods, where tons of huge beams and trees would come flying over that dam. And in this particular case, they had to come back from their 2-hour lunch and break down the stone walls here that they had just built so that the river, which was about to go through the house, because there's a chute, which you'll see later, that was wide open. But most of the time, the guys just kind of hung out at the end of the day in the waterfall, got into the swimming hole and made their way home. But of course, finally, after 3 years of restoration on the building structure itself, they attached the bétonnière, the cement mixer. When they attach that and go home with it, you're never going to see them again. And that was the case. And they left us with this wonderful building that we miss desperately. Here's the backyard. You can see all of the different terraces here. This went way up to the top of a road. We were in a very steep canyon. I think there were over 12 or 14 terraces in total. And there's the roof. And what seemed like, and the chimneys, we had lots of new chimneys. what seemed like miles of Lowe's stones. And while these look small, they're not. They start very large and work their way up to being very small and very heavy. So we started here, we ended up here. And I'm going to go quickly through a series of befores and afters. This is the entry to the mill before. This is after. Well, I hadn't actually painted the last shutter yet. This is a niche in the kitchen before and after. The kitchen sink before and after. The dining kitchen and my stove. I had to leave my stove. It's a Leconche stove, not the big, hyper expensive one, but I love that thing. And here's a view of the long lower room in the mill from where the millworks are inside these mysterious wooden coffre cases here. And then there's this mysterious looking thing, which you'll also see later, and that's me having lunch at the dining room table. The salon, and that's the mill. That's looking back the other way. That's the mill business down there. Guest room, which used to be an attic. And this was the guest bathroom with what used to be the kitchen sink when the last millers still lived there. This is the guest salon area, an extra bedroom if we needed it, another bedroom. And here I show you that whenever there was a mill bit, whether this was a device to clean the grain, we left it there. The grain would have been hauled up into this room, which was at once an attic, and then dropped through a hole in the floor to get to the mill. And we kept all those pieces. This is me standing on the what I didn't know what it was, with the roof of what we thought might be a bread oven, because we just figured a place like this had to have one. This is before and this is after. This is where I was standing. All these walls had crumbled in, and with all the greenery, we really didn't even know where we were. This is that we found out that the bread oven had been bricked in because the opening was inside the barn where grain was stored, and that became illegal in the early 1900s. So Bernard and his guys poked a hole in the wall, and sure enough, there it was. Someone had carefully put the bricks inside the bread oven so that we could replace, that's the ceiling of the bread oven, by the way, which was, and I know those roots look a little dangerous, but they weren't. That was just the greenery growing in there was in perfect shape. And so we redid it. And that door will come up later. It darkened up pretty fast. And this is an opening into the studio barns, and you'll see this later. And that's us putting a whole bunch of soupe au fromage. We had a big party for all the workers when it was done for about 80 people. We could have baked 60 loaves of bread in that oven, which we never did. We did have some great pizza parties and could put a lot of stuff in there, but it took 2 or 3 days to warm the oven up. It was huge. So we did that not too often. This is a before and an after of the guest house. If it looks like half a house, it's because it's half a house, that the other half had fallen down into the river, and we restored the half that remained and stabilized it. This balcony had been there in the past in order to dry wool felt that the mill used to make probably 150, 200 years ago. That's a before getting into the guest house. This is an after. This is the artist guest studio before and after. And there's Mike, where he belongs in the wine cellar. There's no before because there wasn't a before. I thought I was very clever and went to the building supply for these chimney tiles. And I asked the young lad there how many would fit into a certain size of chimney tile. And he said, "Ça dépend, madame, c'est le Bourgogne ou le Bordeaux." Is it Burgundy or Bordeaux? I obviously wasn't the first person that had asked that. This fine couple, Germain Blanc and his wife, Marthe. Germain was born in the mill. He lived above us in a hamlet. The mill worked as a working mill till 1967. He worked there until he was 23 years old, till he climbed up the hill to marry Marta. This is his father, Louis Blanc. We found his sabot in the pigeon coop. And they taught us everything. They taught us how to cook, how to make confit, which is what we're doing here. I was 12 years old there, right? They taught us how to garden, although they didn't quite understand why we wanted it to not be in straight lines like theirs always were. But boy, could we grow stuff in there because we had water everywhere all the time. These cabbages were 3.5, 4 feet in diameter, not the bulb, but the plants when we were done. And that's me trying to work my way out of the fall garden. Just everything, anything that was 3 feet was 6 feet in that garden. And of course, way too much of everything. And this is Germain crying, because that's what Germain did a lot of, was crying. When one day he had asked me if he could go to Toulouse when I was going to pick Mike up at the airport, because he'd never seen a plane take off before. This is a sustenance farmer who raised 7 children on 6 cows in his little hamlet above the mill. And when he found out that his kids and grandkids had gone together to buy them a ticket to San Francisco, he of course cried. And there we are in San Francisco. Our closest neighbors, I can't say dearest because I'll get in trouble, but Bernard Guérin, who was a Campignon de Bois doing restoration of historic monuments, and his gorgeous wife, Brigitte. I thought Mike had heart problems, so he could get Brigitte come to give him heparin shots, I think, and their neighbor, Max. And Jean-Michel Eveline. Jean-Michel and Mike worked together for years on a variety of projects, and I encourage next to invite him to have his perspective of life in France, and the work they did together was astonishing. But we did ordinary things with our friends, just like we all do. We went hiking in these incredible valleys. We had friends from Brittany. This is up in the very northern part of France, and on the Grande Cause, Serge and Claire. Claire was a professional chef. The most amazing food came out of our French friends' kitchens, I must tell you. And then Jean-Claude, a Roquefort cheese farmer, and obviously his sheep, and his daughter, Florence, who took over the farm when he retired. And in the fall, within 2 weeks, there are about 3 to 4 million sheep that are born. And Mike photographed this several times. And there they are in their little pens. Okay, so here we are. We've got a building now that's sound, but we don't have a flour mill. And that was the next steps towards getting you towards your bread. This was the end of the mill when we bought the place, before and after. And this is the other wall. And this funny looking thing, 16-foot long flour sifter. And this is after, and you'll notice that there are doors on it now. And the old owner who had bought it 30 years before us had taken the doors off, put them out to be picked up by the garbage trucks. Germain saw that passing by in his car, borrowed them, and stored them in his barn for 30 years, so that when we decided to redo the mill, he gifted them back to us. So he didn't really steal them. We started in the restoration of the mill. You have to have a large reservoir of water, which is what this waterfall really is a dam. But it was all silted in. So our brave Bernard, who's back, still our hero, and Peshu came, knocked down this door here, and let loose with 30 years of mud and silt and rocks and beams and horror, washing down our little river further down into the Tarn River. And we did this all on the opening day of fishing season without knowing it. And for those of you who speak French, when the mayor shows up and says, "Qu'est-ce que vous foutez là?" you are in trouble. We ruined the first day of fishing season and heard about it for a very long time. But you can see we had a bulldozer behind the dam digging this all out so we would be able to dam up enough water. That was the first step. These guys, this is a 20 to 25 foot fall down to rocks below. This is Mike, our hero Bernard, and Peshu. And here they are replacing that door that they'd broken down. That water is cold, my friends, very cold. This handsome man is Germain Blanc's son, and he is a forgeron, which is a metal worker, and he did all of the sluices and gates, that is the gates to open up. And he and Mike are pointing at a tunnel here that has to be dug out by hand for the water behind the dam to get into the house. And there's Mike bravely digging out that tunnel. And I want you to know I dug out my own tunnel in the front of the house, another 20 foot. And this is bucket by bucket. There's no mechanical way to do this. So now we have a waterfall and a dam that works. We have a water chute to bring water. Here it is down to the end. And this is probably the most important mechanism of the waterworks, because if this doesn't work, nothing works. And here it is operating. So the water comes from the dam down this chute, overflows into a reservoir that is up against the back of the house, which is where the mill is. This is what we started with. And this was where the water was coming down right into our back door when we had that first flash flood. And this is Germain when he first saw that waterfall work again, crying as he always made me cry, by the way, but he's crying. And this is Germain 50 years before this shot, when his father was still running the mill. And this is the wooden mysterious mechanism at the end of that chute. There wasn't a back terrace, so it didn't really matter because it all just kind of flowed into the reservoir. And this is Mike's dark fake, where he photoshopped Germain Blanc's father, Louis Blanc, into a shot with Germain, his son, and his grandson. And then there's the deepest fake of all. So I'm showing you this picture again, because from here, see where this is the railing, I'm up in the little house here, and I'm looking down on this water chute, and there's gardens above it. And this is the back terrace. There's water underneath that. And this is a bigger reservoir over here against the end of the mill. This little bit higher building is what would have been the beginning of this sequence of buildings, which was the mill. So I'm going to play you another short video. There's the waterfall. It keeps along here. Here's that big waterfall. And it flows back over the river and out underneath our bridge. Now, in the meantime, we got to get all the mill works. And so we had the real guys come, people who do this and know how to restore mills. Mike has become quite an engineer of mills. We call him our mill geek, but we still needed people who had rebuilt these things, because this was gross motor movement here. There are two millstones in this kind of configuration. There's a stone that doesn't move called le meule qui dort, the sleeping stone. And then the one, of course, that turns on the top. And the top one has to be adjustable, because you're going to put grain in there and it can't be too far down or it will catch on fire, and not too high or it won't grind. So these guys knew what they were doing. They tried to do it with old tools that Germain's father would have used, and they just gave up because it was made out of flint and used these grinders. And here they are making sure that that stone and the center of it that's going to connect is perfect. So there's the le meule qui tourne, the top one, and that was replaced later, and I'll show you more. And this is Mike with a group of our artist friends, which should have made us nervous at the time. But anyway, putting the millstone back. And there's Germain teaching Mike and me, because I made my share of flour here, I assure you. These are the mechanisms that control the height of where that millstone is. This is a half ton of rock, by the way, that's spinning inside of a wooden box. And we're able to, from up here, open the sluice gates 25 feet below to get the water running through your house. And here are the guys putting in a 25-foot, that's a 2.5, 2.25 story pillar called an axe that connects to the millstone, that connects it to this horizontal water wheel. And you're probably used to vertical water wheels. Well, this is more efficient in a smaller river like ours. And the whole business turns on a bearing that's buried in this beam. And we were able from up above to raise and lower the whole business, and back here make the water come in. And here's the water. We lift that up and the water comes in, and here you go. So here's Mike, the miller man. Now he's pouring grain into this business, this box called a tremie. And you'll see a funny looking horse's head down here. And the grain is dropping into this little shoebox size box. And this thing is knocking against the tremie so that it knocks the grain down methodically. So this is a very poor, but I hope decipherable. And the flour came out here into a much larger vat. We used to grind maybe 20 pounds of flour at a time and make our bread. So now you know how to make bread in rural France. Now I will tell you, this isn't the first loaf of bread I made, because the first loaf of bread I made, they forgot to wash that grinding stuff off the stones. And it was about, I would say, fully a third sandstone. It was totally inedible. I was furious. But that wasn't enough for the engineer Miller Wonk. We had on our back terrace a walnut oil mill, which we've made run. This millstone stays on its side and goes round and round and makes paste out of nut flesh, like a peanut butter, only walnut butter. That butter went into a large pan, was roasted for hours on my Leconche stove, and then put into this mysterious thing that I showed you before, which is a walnut oil press. And a piece of linen was put in this hole, the roasted, delicious smelling peanut butter that the oil was coming out of on top, this weight on it, and then a 7-foot lever pressing down, which made the oil come out here. And it made the most amazing 7 liters of delicious walnut oil you can imagine. Okay, so now we got our water mill, and now we can make our bread. And now it was time to go make some art. And the plan, this sounds like it was all well planned out, and believe me, it was not. We're about 4 years into our adventure here. We're working on our MFAs. Mike way ahead of me back in San Francisco when we were there 6 months in France. And that was our job. But then I had what I considered to be a brilliant idea. It was actually cheaper for me to buy an airline ticket for a professor and fly him to France, give him a studio space, and work with them for 2 months or 2 weeks, depending on the person, instead of getting my MFA. So that's what we did for the next 17 years. We spent half time in rural France at La Pile en Basse, working with American and French artists, and 6 months back in California, picking our next professors. But the first professors that I really had were the construction workers, Claude and Bernard in particular. This is Bernard teaching me how to cut stone. I think I've told some of you, I had a respirator, glasses, and earmuffs on, and he had a Gauloise cigarette, and that was it. The first thing I did of that, I made stone handles for this ridiculously big pair of scissors that was made, the blades being made out of wood. And for me, we were going through a huge transition. And I saw with Claude and Bernard, the transition between wood and stone was some metaphor for life, that those two interfaces are very difficult, soft and hard. And so I eventually made a stone hammer without, the miller had become a painter, so this became a paintbrush. And I did a whole series of tools. It was my tool phase where I would use transitional materials for me. This is my steel strainer instead of a flour strainer, and a variety of different materials that made no sense for what they were parroting. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about professors. Richard Berger, who was my mentor and dear, dear friend, came to the mill several times. Full of projects, and Richard was head of the sculpture department at San Francisco Art Institute for many years. And he loved to teach beginning people, which I certainly was, and about the care and feeding of an idea, because he was a conceptual artist who really believed there had to be an idea behind it. And he kept saying, I see the traces of all these other millers, but I don't see your traces. What's going on? So he took my thumb.
Get that. Could you try again?
I just activated my Siri.
I don't know what you mean by it. I just
So he took my thumbprint and Mike's thumbprint, and he took them home, blew them up, and came back to France the next year. And he painted in enamel. I'm blue and Mike's red, and laid the tiles in the pig pen. And he figured that this was going to be our lasting traces. And since his father had been a tile layer, that this would be his lasting homage to his father as well. Carol Beadle came a couple of times. We collaborated on a huge piece. The first time she was there with Mariana Goodhart, who's someplace in the audience, as is Carol. We'll talk about her a little later. Carol had come with packing tape and was going to teach me how to make molds easily using this packing tape. And I was thrilled because we were going to make these 4-foot long eggs and hang them in an old barn. And we were going to cover them with chicken feathers. And the only problem with that was that we needed a lot of feathers to do these great big eggs. So we went to a slaughterhouse where they had a lot of chickens. It happened to be, of course, Germain's daughter had an abattoir in Albi. So we came home with a truckload of chicken feathers, which were filthy, had flesh stuck to them. It was absolutely awful. That's me trying to wash them and clean them. We put them in my washer and dryer. It was an absolute nightmare. So you'll notice that on the finished eggs, these are still in the studio. We decided to use garden felt instead of feathers, although we had one lonely. We called him Art Brut. And this is the final piece that was hung in this absolutely glorious arched barn. That's 100 feet long. This is I guess this is probably Mike standing here to give you an idea of scale of these eggs. This is a piece that Carol made out of steel wool hanging in front of the bread oven in the studio barn. I wish I had a great picture of this. I hope she does. My first exhibit was at a chateau, a medieval chateau in a village called Kupiak. If it looks medieval, it is. It's a 13th century chateau. And when you go through the entrance of it, I hope you can see this, there's this funny little banner, which was kind of plastic and it was a tourist thing. But when you walked in, this banner would just float up and down. And I thought, wow, this feudal system didn't last very long. It was really a house of cards. So I asked a friend of mine, what's the idiom for house of cards in French? And she said, Chateau de cartes. So I made a deck of cards. I watermarked the suits in the cards or collaged them. This is 100-foot room. This is 20-foot ceilings. And in the back, there was a bank of motion detected activated fans that would make the banners come moving towards you, and they kind of danced. I loved walking through them, and everyone else did. They sort of hit you kind of shoulder high. I made them holy, and I wanted them to look like old laundry, like old banners hanging in that old building. In Cahors, there was a gallery bookstore. So I said, okay, I got to write a book. So I rewrote my Art Institute manifesto and put it in the bookstore. She wanted to take the books out. I said, no, I want the books there. I want to write a book and be in a bookstore. So there's the cover, the reading lights, which have text on them written in fiber, the spine, and then the turning pages. At Cord-sur-Ciel, which is near Albi, is a 11th or 12th century village that has this glorious public interior space. When you walk in, you have to look up because the light is so beautiful. And I kept going, uh-oh, a pigeon's going to drop a rock on there. What's that going to look like? So I built a bunch of kites to look like that skylight falling. And I learned how to make kites. It's very cool. It's an easy thing to learn how to do. The pit was one of my favorite projects. This is an oubliette in French, where you throw a prisoner down in a dungeon and that's it. You forget about them. And there was a walkway that you could look down into it. And I built a frame that had varying sizes of holes, progressively smaller, dropped that into it, lit it up again on a motion detector so that you leaned over, that would light up and you would fall down this rabbit hole. One of the most fun things I did in France as an artist was the French government, first of all, pays artists to show, which is what a concept. And they hired 6 Aviron artists. I was quite pleased to be included in them, to go into rural schools and introduce kids to contemporary art. And if you've ever watched a documentary called To Be and to Have, it's for your Francophiles out there, you really need to do that. It's a wonderful story. These kids were between 6 and 13. And I did not want to be the person that destroyed their image of what they might do as being artists. So I took the little fine painting and drawing out of it. I brought along with me, these are all our farm kids, right? Their parents are all very successful Roquefort cheese farmers, and they all had big gardens and they're used to helping their parents in the garden. So I brought a bunch of garden tools. Those were the paintbrushes. And I brought a bunch of vegetables that we cut and used as stencils, and that's how they planted their gardens. Because the theme of this show was La Cuisine des Artistes. So they were supposed to do something relating to food. So they would prepare the ground with those tools and then use the stencils to plant their gardens. Then we went outside and they did the same thing on hot houses. Each one had their very own hot house. They got very, very dirty and wonderfully dirty. They had so much fun. And we ended up, each kid, I think there were 23 of them maybe, they had their own hot house. They had a box, a treasure box, and in it they were supposed to write their own manifesto, which I tried to describe to them that those are the things that are most important to you in life that will never change. So there was a lot about moms and dads and cats, which is as well it should be. I planted my garden and rewrote my manifesto on a couple of the kites. We all went into this église désaffectée. This is a désaffectée sounds like it's disinfected church, but it's not. It's a deconsecrated church where they were having exhibits. There are a lot of churches like that in France. We lined up their hothouses, hung my cloak over protection of these kids, and they had a complete vernissage, an opening with their parents, with food and music, and it was a completely non-judgmental experience for them, and everybody had a good time. They made the most wonderful book for me. I wish I could show it to you. This is a show, this is repetitive for some of you, but I will go into a little bit of different detail. This is an art space that had been a monastery, had been a military basis, and was now an art center. So I figured that if you were the second son in a family, you either went into the military or you went into the monastery, because the first kid got the farm, right? So I went to my French artist friends and gave them a deck of cards to draw from. And they either drew they were in the military or monastery. And then I took a mold. I finally got to use the technology that Carol had taught me. I made a mold of their arm and their hand and put them together, put lights in them. And then they had to write something on their cast, just like you do as a kid on when you break your arm. The military guys took it very seriously, and the monastery guys just had a good time with it. I had a bouquet of these, which I lit, and I made a killing field, because I figured the monastery, both the church and the military, had killed a lot of people. And this is the one before was the military. This is the monastery. You had to wend your way through different ways of getting to see these different formations. And they made a lot of widows. And one of the things that's different in France about art is it's very political, because the French government pays for all of this. So if it swings left to right, the art can tend to have to move around in it to get funded. I, of course, didn't know that. And so the Ministre de Culture, it's a big deal in France. When you have an opening, you got the mayors there, you have to give a talk, there's music, there's all kinds of things going on. Well, the Minister of Culture who showed up was an extremely religious man, and I thought he won't get what I was doing there, and he did get what I was doing there. Anyway, in the meantime, while I'm doing these shows in France, I'm writing letters to my sister, who was severely handicapped, and telling her about our adventures here. I'm not there, I am there in this picture. And I actually published a book called Water, Paper, Stone. There's Germaine, 17 years later, holding that book. And we're getting ready to sell the mill. And back in San Francisco, the San Francisco Center for the Book asked me to do a show, an installation there. And I said, well, I will do that if we can make it a walkthrough book, a big book with big pages where you walk through it and it's all hung from the ceiling. And they thought that was a fabulous idea, because they're a fabulous organization. And I encourage all of you to go there and take their classes, and when and if, and probably on Zoom you can. So I invited 17 artists representing the 17 years that we were in this experience. I told them that the ceilings were 15 feet high, and for the French artists, anything you make has to fold up and go in a suitcase, because we're going to come over and get them and bring them back. So here we are in France at Jean-Michel's house with all the French artists together, putting all their work together, and we folded it up and brought it back. I made it the dust cover, water, paper, stone, walkthrough book. That's the front cover. Mike, my husband, made the spine because he held our life together there as far as I'm concerned. And this piece alone should have its own talk. It is his life experience going through the mill, everything from this is literally a stone bridge. He did these wonderful sculptural replicas, models of the millstones. His work below level, he did a lot of mill instructions, his cyanotypes, etc. Kay Bradner, who was one of the professors, did a diary of her time there. And she used my paper. And if you could pull the pages and look at them, it's a lot about our menus, as I recall, grilled duck and lemon tarts and so forth, but all these beautiful drawings, some of which she did when she was there, but most of which came from her studio. This wonderful turning piece had a poem written down the middle of it. You had to get to a certain angle to be able to see it. Dan Pillars, who was the very first visitor that we had, was my studio mate for a million years and helped me set up the studio, first to stay in the little house, and built this spectacular statue that looked out over the waterfall down below. And he believes that life is fragile, and his contributions, his pages were of glass and his fingerprint. Charles Hobson, who, if Charles didn't come every year, it was darn close. And he and Mike would either sit at the front table and paint, or they would go down to the Tarn River and float around in inner tubes and draw and photograph and maybe even oogle the swimming crowd there. And he made a wonderful scroll book, which turns on these spindles, called Matisse's Fishing Pole. And as you scroll through, there are various vignettes of life on the Tarn River and people swimming there. Marianne Goodhart, who was at the time she came, was working in metal, had started out actually as a pastel artist. And the first thing she did was go into the barn and do wall rubbings with pastels. And we found that a lot of the artists that came, they would revert to some part of their art career that was at the very beginning. It was something like being in this very different space was different to them. And Mariana rehung those pieces at the Art Center for the Book and wrote some lovely words about them. Thank you, Mariana. And here is Alice Wingwall and her guide dog Rumba signing her arm, and her husband Donlin. They were wonderful guests, and Alice was the resident, and she would, her contribution at the Center for the Book were these incredible chairs. And in France, she had taken that ubiquitous French white plastic chair and deconstructed them and turned them into wonderful objects, and they were placed in various locations around the mill. And in this detail of this book, she has books within books within books in this piece, and this piece should have its own discussion as well. Jean-Michel Pré, with whom Mike had worked for years on a variety of things I told you. He did this hanging page in this installation, which if you look closely, you see the mill house and the river's kind of zagging around. And if you look at the detail, you start to see closer and you say, what's going on here? And this whole thing on both sides of that hanging piece, by the way, was done with a ballpoint pen, probably a lot of ballpoint pens, and poetry and words about the mill interspersed. Inspiration, le souffle, grâce, the millers in English and in French. Inga Roberts, who was a porcelain artist, did a page in a detail. She had taken impressions of French sheets and laundry and the embossment on it and made porcelain pieces as her contribution. And this is the way you experience this piece. You were inside of this piece. Here's Sheila over here, who lives in France. We spent much time with her. There's Carol pulling out, looking at the pages. There were people who said, well, this should be in a much bigger space. I said, no, you got to be inside this book. You're not going to experience at a distance. I love this. This is Carol talking to Jean-Michel, because Carol's piece was layers of silk that she burned holes into, and then embroidered art as a language of cultural exchange. The back cover, I made the first actual rocks that I made using Carol's technique of making a mold out of them. And I wrote on them the last paragraph of the book, Water, Paper, Stone, and then Richard's turning part in the mill. And those very same stones hung at the Buck Institute, which is that very imposing IMP building north of Nevada in Northern California. And I was bound and determined I was going to figure out a way that Carol and I could not get the structural integrity of a larger piece of that. And I finally figured out that if I put two of them together, or sometimes three or four of them together, and tape that all together, I could make big boulders. And I did that and hung those in that building, and along with a couple of 30-foot trees. And that's me holding one that I think there are 6 rocks in there. I'm not sure. And the whole thing weighed maybe a pound. I cyanotyped some paper and put it on and blasted holes in it so that it stayed transparent and very lightweight. And they just turned slowly on fishing swivels. You can see the holes. This gives you a sense of scale. This is one of the trees that I planted. I'm going to show you, I'm showing you this more as a sense of scale, but also to show you that there's pieces of paper, hanging bark, or whatever they are. And just there in the building. Now, how you make this thing. My studio is actually quite small, and I work outside most of the time. But you can't do that when you've got paper flying around. So Mike is very helpful. We just move all the furniture and turn the house into a studio and put it all together, take it to the Institute, the Buck Institute. And Hero Bernard taught me that il faut que ça soit pratique. It has to be practical. So this was put together. It took about 10 minutes to hang this piece because we just rolled it out. He was more nervous than I was, believe me.
Keep coming.
He was afraid to drop it. And there we are, a lineup of some of the professors about to give me a critique in that show. Now that I'm going to close here with giving you a video of the show that I had at the Sonoma Valley Museum, curated by Linda Keaton, who I think is here. We were to have dancers, Marg Jenkins' dance group, come and dance with us on the 18th of March. And of course, we all know what happened before that. And so many of my friends never got to see this show because it was shut down. So thank you, Linda. And I'm going to show you, this is a short video that Mike did of this. This photo of this little boy walking into the show, I think summarizes my feelings of walking into the mill. I just remember going in and looking around and going, I don't know what any of this stuff is, but it's wonderful. It's sculptural. I want to be there. It was friendly. And I think I can trace anything I've ever made back to that initial contact with the mill. And just like this little boy, I feel like I owe it to the mill, and maybe I owe it to Louis Blanc. I don't know. But anyway, that's the end of my prepared comments on art and bread in stone. And I'm really happy to stick around as long as you can tolerate it, Donna, to answer any questions. So I'll stop sharing my screen now. Okay.